One of the publications that my institute, JPR, produces every month is a digest of media stories about Jewish life in Europe. And in the course of putting together each edition of the digest, a certain type of headline inevitably dominates. Jewish leader warns that anti-Semitism in Europe is like the 1930s. Anti-Semitism hits new record in Europe. Jewish religion is under attack in Europe. Jewish life in Europe is dying a slow death. Are 150 million Europeans anti-Semites or dangerous idiots? Now, as someone involved in the social sciences, my primary interest is to ascertain the extent to which this narrative is accurate. And one of the things I've been struck by is how most recent commentary pieces about Jewish Europe draw on anti-Semitic incident data as one of the proofs of how bad things are getting. And indeed, there were more anti-Semitic incidents in Europe in 2014 than there were in 2013. These are the counts for the UK in dark blue and France in lighter blue. But the story is similar all over Europe, and certainly in Western and Central Europe. But the interesting thing about these data that have been quoted widely is that if we were standing here 12 months ago, looking at the latest data, comparing at that time 2013 with 2012, we would have seen the opposite picture, a decline in anti-Semitic incidents. And for some reason, there was very little commentary about that at the time. Few noticed, and even fewer wrote lengthy commentary pieces about it. And I posed the question, first of all, why might that be? Now, of course, part of the reason is that two data points are never enough. To understand trends, you need multiple data points across time to see what's going on. So here are the counts for the past 11 years for the UK and France. I think it would be difficult to describe this as a picture of increase over time. What seems to be happening is more a case of ups and downs with occasional spikes, notably in both countries in 2009 and in 2014, last year. So let's try and unpack what's happening. And to do so, it's worth looking at the British Community Security Trust data for anti-Semitic incidents in the UK in a little bit more detail. As well as publishing annual counts, the CST also publishes monthly ones. And this is the picture of what's happened every month from the beginning of 2004 to the end of 2014 in the UK. And what we see is a largely flat picture, punctuated by occasional huge spikes in January 2009 and in July and August 2014. And of course the timing is critical because both spikes coincided with major multi-week long conflicts between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza, Operation Cast Lead and Operation Protective Edge. And when those conflicts end, interestingly, the anti-Semitic incidents decline, settling back at around what one might call sort of normal levels. So the suggestion from these data is that we're not witnessing a dramatic increase in anti-Semitism over time, but rather dramatic spikes at particular times aligned directly with the explosion of conflict here in Gaza. But this slide, going back to this one, also raises another issue. If you look closely, you'll see that every year since 2006, there have been more anti-Semitic incidents in the UK than there have been in France. Now, this is really puzzling because I would hazard a guess that if you were to ask a random selection of British and French Jews of which of their two countries they think anti-Semitism is worse, they would come back with one overwhelming answer: France. But these data suggest the opposite. So what's going on? The answer actually has nothing whatsoever to do with reality in France or the UK. The answer is that anti-Semitic incident data are gathered in different countries by different agencies using different inclusion and exclusion criteria, different definitions of what is or isn't an anti-Semitic incident, all in the context of communities with different attitudes to and cultures of reporting in the first place. So in short, these French and British data, both of which are anti-Semitic incident counts for their countries, are not comparable with one another. The trends we see within each set of figures are sound, but comparing the counts with one another without a full understanding of how they were generated will lead to mistaken conclusions. But few commentators take the time to look beyond the counts themselves, and in failing to do so, they often misrepresent precisely what the data mean. But the fact that the situations in France and the UK are different leads me to another important issue. The situation in every country in Europe is different. To talk of rising anti-Semitism in Europe is to make a vast generalization. The Anti-Defamation League demonstrated this perfectly last year when it published its Global 100, a league table, if you like, of countries throughout the world, ranging from the most anti-Semitic to the least anti-Semitic, based on attitudinal polling of the general populations of over 100 countries around the world. So here's the ADL table, ranging from the Palestinian territories in first place, where the highest proportion of people hold anti-Semitic views, according to the ADL's definition, to Sweden in 100th place, where the lowest proportion of people hold anti-Semitic views. Now, the countries highlighted in red are all in Europe, and you can see very clearly that they're not all concentrated in one part of the league table. They are actually scattered across it. Greece and Turkey stand out as major offenders. They're in 17th and 18th place. But by contrast, the UK, the Netherlands, Sweden, all sit at the bottom of the table, with levels of anti-Semitic sentiment apparently lower than those found even in the United States. So Europe is not one place, and any talk of European Jewry is really to vastly simplify the reality. I'm always instantly suspicious of anyone who writes about what is happening to European Jews. There really is no such thing, as many of the young people just said, as a single European Jewish reality. And I don't mean that just in terms of different levels of anti-Semitic sentiment, but also in terms of history and culture and language and politics. Economically, too, Europe is comprised of countries with very large economies like Germany, the UK, and France, to tiny economies like Bosnia, Albania, and Kosovo. And even in the European Union, those countries highlighted here in bold, there's a huge variation along these lines. And, importantly, 80% of all Jews who live in European Union countries live in just 3 of them: France, UK, and Germany, the 3 largest economies in Europe and among the top 6 in the world. But we'll come back to that later. Let's move to another issue. Many have postulated that European Jews are starting to flee the continent in light of the terrorist attacks that have taken place in recent years. After Ilan Halimi and Toulouse and the Brussels Jewish Museum and the kosher supermarket in Paris and the murder of Dan Uzan outside the synagogue in Copenhagen, surely now Jews will leave. Well, let's have a look at the data to see if we can figure out what's going on. These are Aliyah figures from the 4 largest Jewish communities in Europe: France, the UK, Germany, and Hungary, over the past 20 years, from 1995 to 2014. And looking at the bottom 3 lines, which are the data for the UK in red and Germany and Hungary, you can see that the trend is, to all intents and purposes, flat. The UK figures are higher than they are for Germany and Hungary, but that may be largely because the UK Jewish population is considerably higher than the Jewish populations of Germany and Hungary. Only in France is the picture different. Again, one would perhaps expect the counts to be a little bit higher in France because France has the largest Jewish population in Europe, but the picture is more erratic, and most strikingly, the trend has risen dramatically in the past 2 years. Indeed, more French Jews made Aliyah in 2014 than in any previous year in history since 1948. So clearly something is going on there to prompt the movement. But a word of caution even about France. Our gut instinct, my gut instinct, based on recent events and the common perception that life is becoming untenable for French Jews, would guess that the figures for 2015 would be higher still. They'd go in that direction. But based on the data that have come out so far for 2015, which are just the counts for the first 4 months from January to April, it looks like the numbers are actually set to drop in 2015, albeit to a higher level than in 2013. And having inserted that word of caution, let me insert another. In the midst of any talk of an exodus of European Jewry from the continent, it's worth taking a look at these figures in context, i.e., what percentage of the entire French or British or German or Hungarian Jewish populations are making Aliyah. Now, looking at the proportions that made Aliyah between 2010 and 2014, you can see here that they barely made a dent. Over the course of the past 5 years, roughly 1% of British, German, and Hungarian Jews made Aliyah. The proportion for France is a little higher, it's about 3%, but that still means that 97% have not. There is no exodus going on. And just as a quick aside, this view of things also allows us to draw an interesting comparison with the 1930s and the claim that contemporary Europe is becoming like that again. Migration is actually a great measure of how people feel in a particular country because it's a real behavior. It's something people actually do rather than simply think or feel. And when things get bad, when they get really bad, people migrate if they can. So what happened over an average 5-year period in 1930s Germany? Over a quarter of German Jews fled at that time. A low proportion, perhaps when we think about it with the benefit of hindsight, but wildly higher than anything we are seeing in Europe today. Now, of course, the figures here for the past 5 years just refer to the numbers leaving these countries for Israel and not to anywhere else, whereas the German counts for the 1930s refer to migration to any number of destinations, so these are not directly comparable. But then again, Israel didn't exist in the 1930s, so there was no easy option for German Jews wanting to leave at that time, something that's not the case for Jews in Europe today. And either way, the fundamental fact remains. There is no evidence of a widespread exodus of European Jewry or any part of it. All of which leads me to one crunch question. Why aren't they leaving? I want to posit 5 reasons. The first is that they are comfortable. Most, as I said, live in 3 of the largest economies in the world, where in spite of the many challenges that exist, opportunities remain rife. As I said, 80% of European Jews in the European Union live in France, the UK, and Germany. Forget Judaism for a second, forget anti-Semitism for a moment. These are all countries in which it's more than possible to live an economically good and comfortable life. So why leave? Reason number 2, it's home. These data come from a survey that we did for the European Union a couple of years ago, and they show that high proportions of Jews from many countries in Europe feel strong connections to the countries in which they live. Where the counts are lower, in Germany, for example, this is largely because most German Jews only moved there from the former Soviet Union 20 years ago, so they haven't yet had time to cultivate strong feelings of attachment. Reason number 3, European Jews are old. Looking beyond the simple sizes of the different populations, age distribution data tells us something much more interesting. A basic demographic principle. If more people die than are born, a population will decline. If more people are born than die, a population will grow. And when you look at age distribution data for most European Jewish populations, if not all of them, it becomes clear that they are more old than young. Or in other words, they are in decline. Professor Sergio Della Pergola is probably the world's leading Jewish demographer. And what's his assessment of the state of the 4 largest Jewish populations in Europe? France, aging. UK, aging. Hungary, aging. Germany, terminal. Now, the truth is both of these terms are technical terms based on an assessment of the age distribution in each country, but I don't think you need to have a technical understanding of demography to get the point. And of course, the critical point is that old people don't migrate. Some do, of course, but most don't. Young people migrate, people at the beginning of their independent lives when they have the freedom to do so. Part of the reason why European Jews aren't leaving is simply because many of them are old. Reason number 4. Yes, there's anti-Semitism, and yes, it's scary at times. But the truth is, in many countries, the mainstream political leadership has rallied to the Jewish community's side. And this is not just rhetoric. David Cameron, recently, the Prime Minister of Britain, recently announced a further £3 million per annum to help secure Jewish sites across the UK, on top of the 7 million or so that the British government is already putting in. And Manuel Valls recently announced a 40-point plan to combat racism and anti-Semitism in France last month, costing 100 million euros over the next 3 years. For the moment, at least, many Jews in Europe feel as if the government is on their side. And again, just as a quick aside, that's another reason why Europe today bears no resemblance to Europe in the 1930s. You know, after over 200 synagogues were destroyed and 91 Jews were murdered on Kristallnacht, there was no Nazi government plan to invest in securing Jewish sites or to combat racism. On the contrary, the Nazis charged the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks, which is about $400 million today, to clean up the damage. Reason number 5. Those pictures, the ones we all know about how awful everything is, they only capture part of the reality. There are other pictures too, of summer camps, of learning festivals, of cultural festivals, of interfaith endeavours. These are part of the reality too. Indeed, they're a far more common part of the day-to-day reality of many European Jews than direct experiences of violent anti-Semitism. In fact, in one of the very few pieces of research that's been done in recent years looking specifically at Jewish innovation and entrepreneurship in Europe, the authors concluded that Europe is witnessing a revival of contemporary Jewish life through the emergence of hundreds of new initiatives reaching hundreds of thousands of people. Now, with limited data to back that claim up, I think it rather overstates the reality, but there is much going on today in Europe to admire. And occasionally, the media notices that it's not all anti-Semitic terror and Israeli flag burning and quenelles. Occasionally, when we monitor the media, we come across other types of headlines, like defying European anti-Semitism, Hungarian summer camp points to renewal of Jewish life. Moscow has world's second largest limud, the largest, by the way, is in the UK. British Jews riding the wave of a cultural renaissance. Portugal okays law of return for Sephardi Jews. Jewish Culture Festival opens in Berlin. These are headlines too, all real ones, from the press over the past few months. And the truth, I think, lies somewhere between these types of headlines and the ones I showed you about anti-Semitism earlier. It lies somewhere between impending catastrophe and imminent renaissance, the title of a paper we published recently on this topic. There is anti-Semitism and there is anti-Israelism. Of that there is no doubt. And I see little evidence to suggest that it's going to go away at any time soon. But there's also evidence of a government fight back in those countries. There's also evidence of cultural and religious vibrancy. And while some communities are unquestionably more dynamic than others, as is the case everywhere, that too will continue, although it'll be challenged unquestionably by some of the demographic realities that exist. I'm always very wary of projecting forward too far. One of the things I think that Jewish history teaches us is that the future is rarely how we imagined it would be. So for the time being, I would say that the data suggest that Jewish life in Europe will kick on, challenged by momentary spikes in anti-Semitism that instill anxiety and fear, but bolstered too by a steely determination to create a dynamic Jewish life where we are. And in finishing, I suppose the key question for Israel and the rest of world Jewry is, to what extent will you be European Jewry's partners as they confront those inevitable challenges and create those new and enticing opportunities? Thank you.